we have the road to Passkeys, low no code versus SDKs. Rish from Discovery, he's co-founder of Discovery. Please welcome him.
Thank you, June. So I'm not Meir, that's what I'll start with. This was a presentation submitted by Meir, my co-founder. He couldn't make it. He's from Israel, given the situation. I'm Rishi Bhargav, co-founder of Dscope, based in Bay Area. So we're going to talk about Passkeys, different methods of implementation, SDK, low code, no code, and benefits of either approaches. Again, old slide, but very similar profile, co-founder of Dscope, authentication platform. I've been working on low code, no code platform for over a decade. And I've been mostly on the product management and marketing side. But I'm very technical, so feel free to jump in and ask questions as we go through. What we're going to cover is different ways of implementing Passkeys. I have some real-life implementations which we have seen implementation of Passkeys and how they have approached. And we're going to compare and contrast the SDK, low-code, no-code, UX, pre-built UX experiences across here. So let's define first what's no-code, what's low-code. So I think if you look at no-code space, there have been many, many tools that have come around, not just Passkeys, in general, drag-and-drop experiences, products like Webflow, Wix, Workato, Zapier. They have actually implemented a lot of different use cases across and reduced the complexity of implementing applications, implementing workflows, all of those. So that's the no code. Now, low code usually starts by saying, hey, let's add some pieces of code to an existing workflow, or can we enhance or make it more customizable? Examples in this category include retool workflow. Demisto was my previous company where we started with a workflow, but you can augment with your own Python or JavaScript code. Mendix, many, many other solutions out there. But the key here is as you move from no code to low code, you can cater to more extensibility, and people can extend that base platform with their own pieces of code. The big benefits that we have seen in this, and I'll spend more time here going through each, is if you look at, again, the trends over the last few years, engineering cycles, engineering efforts focus on your core product initiatives. Like if you, as an organization, are starting to use Retool, for example, the purpose of using Retool like platform would be, can we build simple applications rather than having to code the entire applications? Another benefit which comes in saving engineering cycles or being able to get early in career people, not very experienced engineers, and leveraging that skill set to continue to build applications. But I think the most important piece that I have seen in experience, those are the two kind of most commonly suggested benefits. The most experience is experimentation, being able to audit what is inside the application. And we'll see some examples, which is, let's say you're building a workflow which says the user comes in, let them log in with a passkey. If the account does not have a verified phone number, send them an OTP to the phone number and verify that. Now, if you code up an application, how do you audit that? How do you change that? How do you modify that over time? How do you experiment with those? Those are some of the benefits which a no-code or a low-code approach brings, which is increases the auditability because of a visual flow. Let's talk about API-first approaches, and then we'll get into more contrast. I think this space, I'm sure everybody's familiar. Examples, Stripe, Twilio, which claimed, hey, start with an API, make the API a first-class citizen, available to every developer with numerous SDKs. So it starts with an API, and then you build a lot of different SDKs for every language out there. And being able to go then build your application using those SDKs and APIs. That's the API-first company approach. The big benefits here is usually developers absolutely love that because it gives them the most flexibility, right? You really are working with, I call the basic of the basic building blocks and starting to build all different experiences on your own. Very, very clear interface for integration. I think one of the biggest things that I hear as a benefit for this approach is clear defined interfaces. Everybody has standards, understands, cater to any developer from who's Golang to Python to JavaScript, all of those. And you can actually go integrate deeply into the application. So that's kind of the biggest benefits in this. There are some references, we'll share the slides. There are some references of other API-first companies and some of the companies that are actually paving the way there. Now let's dive in, where does one approach versus the other approach work better? The areas where the low-code, no-code approach works really, really well in authentication spaces, very easy to onboard stakeholders like product managers, like marketing people, like UX designers. Now, why is that important? If we're specifically looking at authentication and passkeys, the user experience matters. Like even the previous presentation with the GitHub team, if you look at it, like the majority of the conversation was, can we increase the sign up of MFA number, right? Can we have the user experience right? What do you do in case of a failed experience? And we have seen that you cannot get those user experience right without experimentation. And you need product managers involved, you need UX people involved, you need engineers involved. So one of the benefit here is you can start with an experience, modify it, rotate it, and try again, or try two different experiences. So it becomes much easier to run these experiences. Onboarding new developers becomes easy, it's visual, you can see what the experience looks like. Security teams is another interesting thing, right? I mean, one of the biggest questions that comes up is like, hey, can I audit your auth process? Can I see what is going on inside the black box? And security teams can come back in and say, hey, what is the process actually? What happens when an OTP fails? When the OTP fails 3 times or when the passkey fails to log in, what is the recovery experience? Is that recovery experience secure enough because you verify the user's identity or not? Now, one is you can say, hey, here is the process, and it could in code, and it's written in a doc. And there's completely different where you can actually show them, here is the workflow, here is how it runs. Let's go through it step by step. Is this secure? Is this passes compliance and sync? So some of those big benefits. High customization, visual changes could be easier to make. And I think this one I stressed upon earlier, which is you can make changes and you can improve it over time. Integrations is, I think, an interesting one. Of course, you can do integrations even with an SDK-based approach. But this one becomes very interesting if you have tons of third-party integrations. For example, user onboarding, you want to integrate with a customer data platform like a Segment or an Adobe Analytics. Or you want to integrate with your internal APIs. Can you drag and drop some of these services? You want to integrate with a bot detection platform to do certain things. Whenever you are talking of these third-party integrations, the low-code approaches, whether it's Retool, whether it's other Workato-like interfaces, have worked really, really well because they have tons of integrations out there. Usually less work on the front-end side. I think this one, again, these approaches will give you pre-built UI blocks. You drag and drop. You don't need to worry about dealing with the browser side autofill. How do I handle autofill? Did you worry about the FIDO Alliance UX guidance? So a lot of these pre-built components could be beneficial. When it comes to API-first approaches, some really, really strong points there as well. One is, I think, the handling of GitOps, handling of autocomplete in IDE, much better there, right? I mean, you have very, very, like developers are used to operating in a certain way. And if they are developing and if they are owning that, way better experience for them. Feels very native to the developer. You import the SDK, it's in your IDE, you work through that. And when it needs complete control of UI and UX, I mean, I mentioned the other approaches provide you components, but those components are pre-built components, may not have all the options, may not have all the customization you want, may not be the same library you want. And in those scenarios, it's better to go with the API first or SDK approach, where you can really control every aspect of the user experience. Ability to inject part of vendor solution instead of ripping the whole piece out. So I think there could be, you can take only some pieces of it rather than take the full platform. You can take some pieces of it and say, hey, I only want to use the SDK for this part and just do the passkeys rather than the full authentication solution. So there are some benefits. And the last one I think is a very interesting one. I mean, testing always comes at the end in most discussions, but that is a huge benefit, right? If it is a pure SDK approach, automated testing, unit testing becomes very, very critical in either one of those approaches. In the API first approach becomes very powerful. There are some limitations when it comes to the other approaches like no code, low code. But let's actually dig deeper a little bit. Is API first a thing, like only API first? Even if you look at companies such as Stripe, companies such as Twilio, eventually everybody starts with that API, but as you go towards users who are less sophisticated and not your early adopters, then they have gone and actually implemented pre-built components. Stripe actually has a no-code option for using Stripe. And that is literally, I mean, even we being a very strong technical company with strong developers, we said, hey, if I want to get the payment started, take the link, put it there, and get started there, and then we'll do deeper integration at some point of time. So whether you look at Twilio, whether you look at Stripe, everybody has gone down to experiences which are easier to build off rather than go dive into the SDK. I talked enough about customization and how you can get really, really a lot of customization with the SDK approach, right? So on the one hand, SDK approach gives you full customization, really deep customization, but it comes with making the customization much harder. What do I mean by that? If you really customize the whole experience to your liking when you're building it with API and SDK, now you need to go change it. Now you got to modify it. Logic is deep into the app. You're going to go rewrite it, redeploy it, right? So by the way, I think in this presentation, I'm not recommending one or the other. I think what I'm pointing out is depending on your application, depending on the persona and the developers inside the organization, does the UX team or the PM team plays a stronger role in your org? The approach for your team may be different. But even when we have seen customers claim, hey, I really need full customization, then we have seen the customization, it feels really, really strong on the API first side and SDK side, but later on the customization becomes harder over time. And you may be able to do more customization with a low-code approach. So I think carefully evaluate as you're thinking through, which is the customization a one-time thing, or is it an ongoing thing? And you need to experiment with the right flow before you arrive at the right flow. And at that point of time, you may go deeper into that. This is another interesting piece, which is tech stack, large company versus a startup. We work with a lot of startups, a lot of large companies. And I think the right path that you take may depend on who you are, how big is your user base, who is the audience, right? I mean, we looked at some of the example implementation of Passkeys, and people done an amazing, amazing job, like Home Depot. Their audience is either do-it-yourself people or actually contractors. I mean, that implementation of Passkey, they only do it in a very few places, promoted ones, how they deal with it. But understand your audience is the purpose of this slide, which is really go understand what is the user journey for your users, and then go make the decision based on those aspects. And that understanding your persona, understanding your company is very, very critical. B2B, B2C is another decision point I would encourage you guys to think about, because we talked about the UX customizability, and we truly feel that certain use cases when it comes to B2B, you can sacrifice on the UX experiences, right? If you do not get full flexibility in a platform, you can sacrifice in the UX experiences, because the B2B, if some employee of another company logs in, they will log in, even if it is slightly tricky. They will go through the pain. In a B2C, your conversion matters. And UX really needs to cater to that end user. And in that scenario, you don't want to compromise on that. So that's another consideration as you think through the options, think through the flexibility. Fraud prevention is a big requirement as well. So again, whether you verify the user at the time of recoverability or not, a lot of those considerations comes in, and that will play into is the solution catering to the need as well. Let's jump into some case studies. So this is Mesh Payments. They implemented WebAuthn in early 2020. That is when they started. Their team internally built it, and internally built it from scratch, picking up some of the open source libraries. Their advice is to go with a vendor to avoid these pitfalls, right? I mean, I think from their experience, what happened was the entire WebAuthn standard over time evolved. Product team initially looked at only the mobile use cases before other engineering advocated for WebAuthn pieces. So they wanted to start with the Face ID and Touch ID. Then they moved to WebAuthn, right? So doing the native versus WebAuthn. A lot of UX challenges, aligning product, engineering team around the end user experience. So these are similar challenges, right? Do you need to bring in a product manager? Do you need to bring in a UX person? Do you need to bring in engineering? What is the user experience? Focus on that. And they went through a long journey to get it out. And their whole thing was go ahead and figure out some of these experiences before. And they ended up building it on their own, but their recommendation was they would rather buy if they were to revisit this decision, because they went and spent a lot of cycles internally. This is an example website you guys can go check out, but I think this is an example of what you can see. Can you do it quickly? Of course, there's restrictions of this is built, by the way, with a workflow approach or the no-code approach. Go check it out. There's SDK approaches that we have implemented as well, but in this case, you'll see the experience, which is delivered, saves a lot of time. So such an experience could be delivered, and it could be delivered in matter of days actually into your app. Of course, it comes with some of the restrictions that we talked about earlier. We implemented on our website, and this is actually a very, very important experience where in a workflow approach, and this is not about Passkeys, this is in a workflow approach, we tweaked it over time, right? Like we started and saying, hey, just register anybody. Then we said, hey, I'm getting a lot of spam. I don't want free email addresses. So drag and drop a box says, check the email domain of the company. Is this a free email domain? If it is a free email domain, put another thing. So this is the point about third-party integrations, which could become much easier rather than recoding that entire experience again and again. So some of these workflow-like approaches could make that easy. There's a screenshot of the website as well. Over time, how it evolved, give the ability for product managers to tweak. In fact, on the docs website, it could be a different experience. Website could be a different experience. So a product manager owns the experience for the end user, and they have the flexibility to go design that, experiment it, get feedback, change it, rather than having to go to developers every time you need to change that experience. There is a study of an edutech company, large edutech company, 100,000 users. They have students, universities, and lenders. Very different audience. If you think about banks, they want very high security. Students, they want amazing UX. And for the universities, they want to sign into the corporate experience. So they started with an API-first approach to slice the login. And they were a very strong technical team. So it says, hey, they want to replace and control, like replace their existing auth, keep their UX, and start with users which are less UX sensitive, right? So started with API first approach, and now moving on to no code for a different subset of users. So then it says, hey, let's move with no code, add capabilities like bot protection over time. So keep incrementing. I think the bottom line that's coming into when you want to keep improving and incrementing, the no code approaches work very well. If you know what you're building, API approaches work really, really well. So if you've narrowed down and you know your audience, this is the experience that you want, then you go deep with those approaches. Last slide. This is another case study. A small startup focusing on sales tools. They are using a mix of both, and very interesting because they are actually starting and saying, we know that for the website we need to experiment, for our product authentication we know what we want. So product authentication, they're going with API and SDKs. We know the experience, static, built it. Website, they want to experiment, and I think that's perfectly fine. It's not one approach versus another. You can actually, depending on the audience, depending on the other aspect, can mix and match as well. So they are going a mixed approach. I think that's the last slides. Happy to take questions as well.
We don't have any question online yet, so maybe open to the floor. Anyone in the room? Questions? Oh, here we go.
Thank you. Great presentation, really clear. What do you think is the biggest measure of success for things like no code? I mean, you mentioned earlier around introducing different stakeholders and getting those people involved in the journey. But once that's done and it's live and it's working, what does success look like? Is it reducing change? Is it handling exceptions to the process? Just
yeah, I think in my experience, that's a good point. That's a very, very good question. In my experience, measuring the success of a no-code or low-code approach, it's the rate of change, or can you handle the change over time quick enough? It's not the initial implementation. Of course, initial implementation is faster with no-code, but what you really want to see is, can you handle change over time to get to your goal, right? Like, as I mentioned, some of the pros for API and SDK approaches, if you start and you know exactly what you want and the rate of change expected is low, go with that approach, build that out. But if the rate of change is going to be there and if you're going to experiment, so I would say rate of change, can you handle the changes quick enough? Can the changes be handled by the team that's available or out of band? Typically, engineering team will have their plan, set on the plan, a change comes in, do you now go change the plan, right? So that's kind of one of the core measures there.
What are some of the compromises or with no code versus API approach? But because given a chance, I would go with no code, right? So there must be something that you have.
Absolutely. So few compromises that I mentioned earlier, right? As I think, again, depends on the tool, depends on things. The level of customizability and control will be less, no matter, right? I mean, when you're given a raw API as a developer, you really control the experience. So that is one important thing, which is the level of control that is available in low code is somewhat limited in most cases. As you explore, and maybe that's not apparent in the beginning, but as you go deeper and deeper, you might find that, hey, I cannot do all the pieces. So I think that is the biggest compromise that I feel in a no code approach is the level of customization may be limited, but depends on how far will you hit that, or maybe not hit that in most cases.
A question here for you on specifically the no-code approach or low-code approach to FIDO and Passkey adoption. The ecosystem has had different capabilities evolving on different platforms at a different time and rate. So how do you choose what the experiences are? Can you talk a little bit about the compromises and trade-offs that you made so you could actually have a consistent,
yes,
capability-driven experience?
That I think is a good question. I think goes to, I think it's towards descope a little bit. This presentation is not about descope per se, but I have seen, and I think that's actually a benefit for a no-code approach. So like, if you use an external provider, which provides your UX components, it's provider's responsibility to deal with Chrome browser experience and autofill, and the Safari experience and an autofill, or a mobile experience, and how does that work. You should rely on the provider if you're going with that approach. Otherwise, in the other case, as the ecosystem has been evolving, then you need to deal with that as you grow your audience. You say, okay, now I have large number of Firefox audience. How do I deal with the Firefox experience? So I think it's evolving. I'll still say we haven't nailed it, and we meaning as an ecosystem, we have not nailed it with Fido, or the UX guidelines are evolving and been working with the Fido team. And we on the product side have been evolving, but I think that is a big undertaking, and that's kind of a pro for that approach. Again, just to clarify, Dscope handles both approaches. You can go with API SDKs, workflows, available both. But that's I think, is a very good point. If you go with pre-built components, then yes, you should rely on the vendor to take care of those approaches.
So Rishi, we're out of time, but just wanted to let you know, gentleman over there has such a good question for you. So please follow with it during the break.
Okay.
So closing remarks, please.
Thank you, everybody. I think closing remarks was, I'll sum up, which is either approaches is fine. I think my T-shirt says it all. Passwords was 60% of the time, every time. So I'm a big believer in Passkeys. I think fundamentally look at your audience, which is your customers, look at your team that is building it, and look at, do you know the experience you want to build and that journey? And based on that, choose the API first versus the no-code approaches. Thank you.
Thank you.